Take a look back at the top stories of the past 7 days and try to put them into some perspective. Well, before we go on, let me introduce you to my panel of journalists tonight. They are Vivian Walsh, she's a contributor for Time magazine. Good evening to you, Vivian.
Good evening.
Alberto Romagnoli is a correspondent for Rai TV. Good to have you with us, Alberto. Greg Viscusi is here with us. He's a reporter for Bloomberg News. Hello again, Greg. And Armin Georgian, our very own international affairs editor, is here with us as well. Straight then to our top story. And Syria's conflict became increasingly violent this week as the battle raged on in the biggest city, Aleppo. Well, the Free Syrian Army claimed it was gaining the upper hand, but regime forces used heavy artillery to shell rebel positions, and neither side seems close to a decisive victory. Well, President Bashar al-Assad said the outcome in Aleppo would determine the fate of Syria in the long term. Meanwhile, international diplomacy hitting another dead end this week. UN envoy Kofi Annan threw in the towel. For him, bringing peace to Syria was a mission impossible.
The bloodshed continues, most of all because of Syrian government's intransigence and continuing refusal to implement the six-point plan, and also because of the escalating military campaign of the opposition, all of which is compounded by the disunity of the international community. At a time when the Syrian people desperately need action, there continues to be finger-pointing and name-calling in the Security Council.
And in New York, the UN General Assembly voted against its own Security Council. A Saudi proposal, a resolution put forward to criticise the Security Council for not doing enough to stop the violence in Syria, was overwhelmingly passed with 133 votes in favour, 31 abstentions and 12 noes. Well, let's talk a bit about the situation in Syria. Vivian Wall, first of all, this vote at the UN, does it change anything for us today?
No, it's pretty much toothless, as we know. I mean, all the moves to get unilateral sanctions passed, all those kinds of moves were blocked, not just by Russia, incidentally, but also by India, Brazil, South Africa, several other countries who've lobbied hard against it. So certainly it doesn't, but it does put a kind of moral voice to where we're at in Syria at the moment, especially with Ban Ki-moon drawing the links between what's going on in Syria and what went on in Bosnia, and saying at this point the world is witnessing something just the same and needs to, in essence, intervene in the same way.
Armin Georgian, what about Kofi Annan's reasons for stepping down? He laid them out in a long letter in the Financial Times today, just basically saying that he was pointing his finger, wasn't he, at the UN Security Council, which has just been criticised by the General Assembly. Again, couldn't come to an agreement, couldn't reach any consensus, couldn't do anything.
I think the interesting thing, though, is in that letter he did shed some of the usual diplomatic language. He was talking at times in the language of the Syrian opposition itself, talking about the yearning for freedom, the desire to overthrow a dictatorship, and he used the word dictatorship. So that was interesting, but at the same time he stopped short of unequivocally condemning Russia and China. I mean, he did actually have some harsh words for the supporters of the Syrian opposition, not directly naming Qatar and Saudi Arabia, but did warn about the escalation through a proxy war. And we heard at the UN vote this Friday as well that the French, the repeated references to the French foreign minister, who admitted that the Qataris were arming the Free Syrian Army, and the Saudis too. And so I think that gave an interesting backdrop to this sort of prophetic, perhaps, warning that Kofi Annan had in his letter to the Financial Times.
Vivian, the rebels are certainly getting more organised, and they are clearly better armed than they were earlier in the year. That's for sure. But the problem is we don't know who they are, do we? We know that some of them are defected members from the Syrian army, soldiers who have left, but there is also an element of international jihadism working its way in as well.
There certainly is, and we've heard reports, for example, from journalists who were kidnapped and were released last week, that some of their captors were Chechens and various other foreign nationals. So we certainly have proof on the ground that there's been foreign infiltration into the opposition, and this obviously gives us pause to think and And one has to wonder how this is all going to look in a year or two's time when we look back. And in other words, this isn't simply a conflict between goodies and baddies, as we sometimes are led to believe. It's a lot more complex.
And if I can add, that came out very much today in the debate, the General Assembly, because I was listening to the different delegations, and there was a clear divide between those like the Saudis, for whom this is a clear-cut moral case, we have to intervene to stop Assad butchering his own population, and others, the South African representative was basically saying exactly that. This is not black and white, and that there are two sides to the Syrian story, and it seems that a lot of people in the General Assembly are apparently accepting that view.
And part of the problem, Kofi Annan is saying, isn't he, Alberto Romagnoli, he's saying that because the conflict has been allowed to drag on for so long, it has warped into this very different animal. It's more sectarian and it's more complicated, and there's a lot more violence and a lot more weapons flying around Syria right now.
Yeah, I think it's very difficult to understand. That's one of the reasons why there is not enough pressure on the European governments, because the public opinions don't understand too much and don't understand the roles in the comedy. Who, as we were saying, is evident there are not all the good guys on one side, but who are the good guys, who are the bad guys. So I think that it's difficult to understand.
And the longer it drags on, the worse it seems to get.
Well, of course. I mean, the longer it drags on, the more militarized it is. I've been talking to a lot of Syrian opposition people this week who basically say there is no more political solution. This is a fight to the end. And one has to imagine what comes after that fight to the end, how much retribution, how many scores to settle, and how many regional players now get involved, Iran, the Saudis, Iraqis, and so on. This could be a very long-term, messy affair, and we might just be seeing the beginning phase of it.
One of the most disturbing things we saw this week, Armin, was that footage which purportedly showed the rebels seizing supporters of President al-Assad and executing them. I mean, this is clearly becoming extremely frightening, isn't it?
Well, of course, and there's also this whole question of weapons deliveries. New York Times had an interesting report this Friday about the balance of power between the rebels and the army and how it might be changing, particularly if the rebels get certain supplies of heat-seeking missiles to down helicopters, because that's basically, Assad has been using these attack helicopters on the opposition, and so we could see that there's a lot of, as Vivian was saying, kind of unknowns as this drags on about how the military balance could shift as well, and that obviously is going to be very much linked to how these proxies get involved, the Saudis, Qataris on one side, perhaps Iranians and Hezbollah at some point on the other side.
And Kofi Annan did end that piece, didn't he, on a note of some sort of optimism. He said a political transition is still a possibility, but in the West we're hearing more and more talk about decapitating the regime rather than overthrowing it, and he's urging enemies of Assad's regime to accept that some elements of that regime will inevitably have to stay in power.
I think one of the really troublesome things about this conflict is that the opposition has made very little move to reach out to people within the regime and to try split the regime. There's been very, very little of that. There's been very, very few defections, and there's been very few reassurances coming from the opposition that, if you defect, you will be okay, and, the Alawites will not be wiped out. And it seems to me like they've made very little headway, even after 17 months in that respect.
I mean, this isn't what we saw in Libya, is it, where we saw those mass defections?
Completely opposite, of course. I mean, the Libyan revolt began with major defections from inside the Gaddafi regime, and those people are now running the new Libya. We're way past that phase in Syria, but nonetheless, it's not too late, perhaps, to reach out within, certain segments of Assad's base and try split the support for the regime, it seems to me.
Greg Viscusi, what's your take on the situation in Syria?
I mean, we're being also gloomy here. If I could just sort of throw in maybe a little bit of optimism. I mean, probably a military solution is inevitable. I mean, you do have to have a winner in one of these cases, and I think that it was pretty clear a long time ago that the two sides were not going to sit down and work out some sort of a deal. So maybe it is just a cleaner solution if we do have a military victory by the rebels. And yes, okay, so there's a lot of foreign groups that have come into the country to take part in the fight, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're not going to have elections afterwards. I mean, we've had in every country that's had a revolt so far, whether it's Egypt, whether it's Tunisia, whether it's Libya, they went to relatively free and open elections afterwards. I would think that would be the same thing that would happen in Syria. I mean, I'm no expert on Syria, but I've been there, and most Syrians strike you as perfectly reasonable and moderate people. So, I mean, as long as there is an election afterwards, I think we can just hope for the best. I'm not saying I'm optimistic, but we're all being so gloomy here that I think one should just sort of throw in a few elements of optimism.
I mean, and in the meantime, of course, we've got a terrible refugee crisis. I mean, 1.5 million people are displaced within Syria. We've got tens of thousands in Lebanon, in Turkey, and elsewhere. I think the head of the UN Refugee Agency today said this was an unprecedented humanitarian crisis. And it has implications, of course, for the region, doesn't it?
Yeah, and don't forget, I think something like 1 million Iraqis fled Iraq and went to Syria. And, many of those are kind of being uprooted.
10,000 Iraqis
Oh, I
decided to
beg
go
your
home.
pardon.
10,000 Iraqis.
Have gone home.
They've decided Iraq is safer.
Oh, right,
than
okay.
Syria.
They've decided Iraq is, which of course it is at this point. I mean, obviously the humanitarian crisis is really, really severe, but that's something the international community can certainly deal with. The military conflict is obviously much more difficult to overcome.
This one's clearly going to run and run. Okay, let's go on to our next then. Now, just last week, he pledged to do whatever it takes to save the euro, but investors remained unconvinced by comments made by ECB boss Mario Draghi this Thursday. The head of the European Central Bank admitted that borrowing costs for Spain and Italy were unacceptable, but he did stop short of unleashing unlimited funds, and there was further speculation that Spain would be forced to ask for a financial bailout. This wasn't the so-called big bazooka that markets had been waiting for, but all eyes turned to the United States on Friday after some better than expected jobs data lifted European stocks to end a jittery week higher. There you can go. That's what happened. Greg Viscusi, the markets wanted unlimited funding, didn't they? They wanted Mario Draghi to turn around and say, we're going to give you all the money in the world, all the reserves we have, and we're going to fix this crisis. He did not do that.
It was ridiculous of them to expect that there was going to be a bazooka on Thursday. And in fact, you said they were disappointed on Thursday, and then Friday they suddenly were happy again with what he said, and there was a major rally in Spanish and Italian bonds. The markets are dysfunctional. I mean, there's just no question right now markets are dysfunctional. There's no other way to put it, which is why Mario Draghi is in favor of intervention to buy bonds of some of these countries in order to make sure what you call transmission works. So you've got an extremely low interest rate from the European Central Bank, but it's not showing up in countries like Italy or Spain because of all the nervousness in the markets. And so he wants to be able to intervene on the markets in order to bring down those borrowing costs. But he does, on the one hand, he doesn't want to let these countries off the hook completely. I mean, there is structural work that has to be done in Spain and Italy. I mean, they've done a lot of it, and their argument is that we should be rewarded for it. On the other hand, he's also got the Germans who are very nervous about anything. So I think he's really doing the most possible. And I think it's kind of ridiculous of people in the market say, oh, he's not doing enough. It's not something that's going to be solved overnight. He's moved the debate forward enormously, just in a few weeks. So,
Alberto Romagnoli, I mean, it seems to me that the Italians and the Spanish are saying, yes, we want help, but we're not prepared to ask for it, and we don't want to abide by the same terms that have been imposed on Greece, given what's happened there. Do you think that's a fair assessment of what's going on right now?
I think that the Italian citizen has the feeling that they've done a great part of the job, so the government can ask them more. That's the point. I don't know if as my colleague said, the markets are they don't work very well, but they are going to have for sure political consequences. We are going to have elections in Italy next spring, and we hope that we will be not an election on Europe between parties for Europe and party against Europe. That would be terrible. So I think that the Italians are saying, as you were saying, we have done our duty, so let's give some help.
Given that Mario Monti is the one who's been imposing all of these austerity measures on the Italians, do you think that'll be the end of him, like so many European leaders before him have seen their term ended by the austerity programmes.
We think that there is a political debate about Mario Monti in Italy too, because he said, I will be here until the end before the election. Then a lot of parties are saying, no, we need him, and to be credible in Europe, we need him again. But that's a big question for the Italian
But Monti has said that he won't run in the elections next spring. But there is the question of whether or not some parties who feel that they're not yet ready to step into this hot seat wouldn't mind keeping him on, let him do the hard work.
Well, there's even
Because they don't
rumours
want to be in power to impose they don't want to be in power when all these hard decisions have to be taken.
Well, there's even rumours Berlusconi might be making a comeback, but let's not go there. The Germans are getting a lot of the blame for this, aren't they? They're being accused of not letting the European institutions really properly intervene in the bond markets and elsewhere. Do you think that that's fair?
I mean, I understand the German point of view, but on the other hand, the euro was a political project from the beginning. It was not an economic project. It was a political project. The Germans signed up to it. And so at this point, Draghi's right. They have to do whatever is needed to save it. And the Germans are getting a major gain right now. I mean, the Germans say there should be no transfers within Europe from state to state. But there is a transfer going on. When Germany basically borrows for free, which is the case right now, German interest rates are at 0. And when the Italians and the Spanish borrow at 6 or 7%, that is a transfer. So the Germans are gaining billions and billions of dollars in unpaid interest they don't have to pay right now. So there is a transfer going on. So I think there has to be some give and take on this. And I think the Germans, it's a fair argument when people say that the Germans are just being a little too stubborn. It's like, when a house is burning, you don't sit down and argue about the terms of the insurance contract. You put out the fire.
Yeah.
And that's the criticism of the Germans.
And the big question, of course, is can the euro survive? I mean, Mario Draghi said it again, the euro is irreversible, don't bother betting against it. Is that enough to reassure everyone?
My view is that they'll just stumble through it. Each step of the way, they'll just do the bare minimum of what's needed to keep it together. That's kind of how the EU works to begin with. It's kind of the way the EU is condemned to work, because you've got so many countries you've got to get together with their own parliamentary calendars, their own systems of government. So I think there is a certain muddling through that is just intrinsic to the EU. And so it just means the crisis will last longer and cost more to solve. But I think at each step of the way, and then the Germans at each step of the way have stepped back from the brink and done what's needed at that moment to keep things going. So I think we will see it survive, yes.
All right, okay. We're going to take a short break. When we come back, the second part of The World This Week, plus we'll have the international headlines as well. Don't go away.